The old ship cut through the void like a blade through darkness, and Yuna watched the battle unfold on screens that flickered with age but still showed the truth of what was happening. Coalition vessels drifted without power as Silent One boarding. Parties swarmed through their corridors, and the screams that came over the few working communication channels told a story of slaughter that made her grip her sword until her knuckles turned white. "We are approaching the command carrier," Sari reported from her station. "Silent One vessels are moving to intercept. Let them come." Yuna replied, "They cannot disable what runs on fire and steel." The enemy ships closed in, and weapons that should have torn through their hull sparked and fizzled against the old technology that predated their EMP fields, and Yuna felt a fierce satisfaction as confusion spread through the Silent One formations. They had built their entire strategy around making technology fail, and they had never considered that someone might fly toward them in a ship that needed no technology to function. "Prepare for boarding," Yuna commanded. "We are going straight through their lines to the carrier." The old ship slammed into the docking bay of the Coalition command carrier with a crash that threw everyone against their harnesses, and before the dust had settled, Yuna was on her feet and leading the charge down the boarding ramp. Silent Ones met them in the corridor, and the battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. Steel clashed against shadow blades, and soldiers who had learned to fight in just a few short weeks stood against enemies who had conquered dozens of worlds, and the corridor became a chaos of blood and fury. Yuna moved through the enemy like a storm, her sword singing its ancient song, and behind her came Zorth with his massive war axe, and Sari with her steel rod, and 200 warriors who refused to fall. They pushed through deck after deck, freeing trapped Coalition soldiers and giving them weapons torn from the walls. And their numbers grew with every corridor they cleared. "The bridge is ahead," Vex shouted over the roar of combat. "But they have fortified it." Yuna saw what he meant as they approached the final corridor, where at least 50 Silent Ones had formed a barrier of shadow and death. The supreme commander of this fleet was behind those doors, and if they could not reach him, then the battle would continue until everyone was dead. "I need volunteers to hold this position," she called out. "Everyone else comes with me through that line." She expected a handful to step forward, but instead nearly every soldier who had joined them raised their weapons and shouted their willingness to fight. These were beings who had laughed at her steel sword just weeks ago, and now they stood ready to die beside her, because she had shown them something they'd forgotten, that the fire of a warrior burned in the heart, not in the weapon. "Then we go together," Yuna said, "and we do not stop until this is over." They charged, and the Silent Ones met them with everything they had. The fighting was brutal and personal in a way that energy weapons could never be, and Yuna felt every strike vibrate through her arms as she cut her way toward the bridge. Soldiers fell around her. Some she had trained, and some she had never met, and their sacrifice carved a path through the enemy that nothing could close. Sari stayed at her side through it all, blocking blows that would have killed Yuna and taking wounds that would have dropped anyone less determined. "Almost there," the young Melvini gasped, her silver-blue skin streaked with blood, both her own and others. The bridge doors loomed before them, and Yuna gathered the last of her strength for one final push. She hit the doors at a full run with Zorth beside her, and together they burst through into the command center where the Silent One fleet commander waited. He was larger than the others, nearly 3 meters tall, and the darkness that clung to him was so deep that it hurt to look at him directly. "Human," he said, and his voice was like the death of stars. "You have fought well, but it changes nothing. We are inevitable." "Nothing is inevitable," Yuna replied, raising her sword, "except the courage of those who refuse to surrender." He came at her with speed that defied comprehension, and his shadow blade moved in patterns she could barely follow. She took cuts on her arms and legs and felt the cold burn of his weapon against her skin, but she did not retreat. This was the moment her family had prepared for across generations. The battle that would decide whether humanity's oldest traditions had any place in a galaxy of light and fire. She thought of her father, teaching her the basic forms in their small house on Earth, and her grandmother telling stories of ancestors who had carried this sword against impossible odds, and she felt their strength flowing into her like a river joining the sea. The Silent One struck at her hard, and she twisted aside, just enough to let the blade pass by her chest, and then she brought her sword up in an arc that her family had practiced for 500 years. The blade caught him beneath the arm where his armor was weakest and drove deep into whatever passed for vital organs in his strange body. He screamed, and the sound was triumph turned to ashes. "This is not possible," he gasped as he fell. "It is always possible," Una said, standing over him with her sword red from hilt to tip. "That is what you never understood about us." The Silent One fleet broke when word spread that their supreme commander had fallen to a human with a steel sword, and the battle that had seemed lost just hours ago turned into a complete coalition victory. Una stood on the bridge of the command carrier surrounded by soldiers who cheered her name, and she felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. Sari appeared beside her with bandages and worry in her 4 eyes, and Una let herself be guided to a seat while the young Melviny tended her wounds. "You saved us all," Sari said quietly. "We saved each other," Una corrected. 3 months later, Una stood in the great training hall of Nexus Prime watching a new class of cadets receive their weapons. Each one was given a plasma rifle and an energy shield, and all the technology that the Coalition had always relied upon. But each one was also given a blade. Simple and unadorned, forged from steel or ceramic or whatever material their species favored. Commander Thalos stood beside her with a respect in his amber eyes that had not faded since the battle. "Traditional combat training is now mandatory for all Coalition soldiers," he said. "By order of the High Command, no one graduates from any academy without proving proficiency in weapons that need no power." Sari walked among the new cadets, an instructor now despite her youth, and Una felt pride swell in her chest as she watched her first student become a teacher in her own right. "They will never laugh at steel again," Delos said. "No," Una agreed, looking at her sword that hung at her side as it always would. "They will never laugh at steel again." The cadets began their first lesson, and Una watched them struggle with these strange weapons that felt so different from everything they had trained with before. But she also saw determination in their faces, and she knew that when the next threat came, whether it was the Silent Ones returning or something new that no one had imagined, these warriors would be ready. Because sometimes the old ways were not obsolete. Sometimes they were just waiting for the galaxy to remember why they had endured. Una woke to the smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of medical equipment, and for a long moment, she did not know where she was or how she had gotten there. White lights pressed against her closed eyelids, and she could feel bandages wrapped around her chest and arms, and she remembered the fight in fragments. The flash of shadow blades and the screams of the Silent Ones, and Sari swinging her steel rod with desperate courage. She opened her eyes and found herself in a medical bay on Nexus Prime with tubes running into her arms and monitors tracking every beat of her heart. "You are awake," said a voice. She recognized Commander Thalos stood at the foot of her bed with his amber eyes fixed on her face, and his expression was something she had never seen on him before. He looked humbled. "The mission?" Una started to ask, but her voice came out as a croak, and she had to swallow before trying again. "The prisoners, all rescued," Thalos replied. 32 personnel, including 3 Coalition admirals and 5 senior intelligence officers who were being transported to an unknown location by the Silent Ones. He paused, and something shifted in his ancient features. "They told us what happened in that chamber," he continued. "They said you walked in alone against 12 enemies, and you killed 7 of them before your team could reach the prisoners. not alone. Una said, thinking of Sari and her steel rod. Never alone. The young Melviny cadet is fine. Theo said, reading the question in her eyes. She has been sitting outside this room for 3 days waiting for you to wake up, and I had to order her to eat and sleep, or she would have withered to nothing. Una felt relief wash through her, like warm water, and she closed her eyes for a moment to let it sink in. Commander, she said, what do you know about the Silent Ones? Delos pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down, and suddenly he looked very old and very tired. More than I did a week ago, he admitted. We have been studying the technology they use, and we have learned something disturbing. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. Their EMP devices are not experimental prototypes, he said. They are mass-produced, and our intelligence suggests they have enough to disable every coalition fleet in the sector. The implications hit Una like a punch to her wounded chest, and she struggled to sit up despite the pain. They are planning an invasion, she said. Yes, Theos confirmed. And when they come, our plasma weapons will be useless, our shields will fail, and our soldiers will be as helpless as newborns. He met her eyes, and she saw something there. That might have been respect, unless we can teach them to fight without technology. He finished. Una understood what he was asking, and the weight of it settled on her shoulders like a mountain. How long do we have? She asked. Weeks at most, Thelos replied. Perhaps less. Then we have work to do. The next days blurred together, as Una pushed through her recovery faster than the doctors advised and threw herself into planning the impossible. She worked with Sari and Vex and a growing team of officers who had stopped laughing at her steel sword after hearing what had happened on Outpost KV-7. They gathered every weapon that did not require power. Swords and spears and clubs from a dozen different worlds, and they studied the fighting styles of species that had relied on blades for millennia before discovering plasma, but teaching soldiers who had trained their whole lives with technology. To suddenly fight without it was like teaching fish to climb trees. They keep reaching for rifles that will not fire. Sari said after a frustrating training session, their instincts are wrong. Then we must give them new instincts. Una replied, faster than anyone has ever learned before. She pushed them harder than she had ever pushed herself, and she watched them fail and struggle and slowly begin to improve. Zorth joined the training after the 3rd day. The same Kreth warrior who had challenged her when she first arrived, and he threw himself into learning with a passion that surprised everyone. I was wrong about you, he told her one evening as they practiced blocks and strikes. My pride blinded me to the truth of what you carried. We were all wrong about something. Una replied, what matters is what we do now. Word spread through the coalition about the human who had defeated the Silent Ones with a steel sword, and requests began arriving from other stations and ships asking for training, but there was no time to send instructors everywhere. And Una knew that when the attack came, many soldiers would face the Silent Ones without ever having learned to fight without power. She was working late one night, refining training schedules and reading intelligence reports, when the alarm sirens began to wail. Red lights flashed through the corridors, and voices shouted over the communication system about incoming hostiles and disabled weapons, and Una felt her blood turn to ice. They were out of time. She grabbed her sword and ran toward the command center, where chaos had already taken hold as officers shouted conflicting orders and soldiers scrambled to find positions they had never trained. For the Silent Ones are attacking across 5 sectors simultaneously. Someone yelled, our entire fleet is dark. Una pushed through the crowd until she reached Commander Thalos, who stood at the central display, watching the disaster unfold. Ships drifted powerless as Silent One vessels closed in, and stations reported hand-to-hand combat in their corridors, and everywhere the story was the same. Plasma had failed, and the coalition was falling. Commander, Una said, give me a ship. All our ships are disabled. He replied without looking at her. Not the old ones, she said. The museum vessels in the Heritage Bay. The ones that run on chemical engines and manual systems. They have no electronics. To disable. Talos turned to face her and she saw the last flicker of hope ignite in his ancient eyes. Those ships have not flown in centuries, he said. Then it is time they remembered how, 2 hours later, Una stood on the bridge of a ship that had been old when her grandparents were young, and she felt the rumble of chemical engines through the deck plates as they roared to life for. The first time in generations, Sari stood beside her along with Zarth and Vex and 200 volunteers who had chosen to fly into battle with nothing but steel and courage. All hands, Una said into the communication system that crackled with static but still worked. We are going to save the Coalition today. Not because we have better technology, but because we have something they can never disable. She drew her sword and held it high. We have the will to fight. The old ship launched from Nexus Prime and burned toward the nearest battle, where Coalition soldiers were dying by the hundreds, and the Silent Ones believed their victory was already assured. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The darkness pressed against them like a living thing, and the hum grew louder with each passing second as something moved through the corridors toward the stranded rescue team. My weapon is dead, Vex shouted, his voice cracking with a fear that Una had never heard from a Torvin before. All our weapons are dead. The soldiers around her were clicking uselessly at plasma rifles that would not fire and activating shields that would not form, and Una could smell their terror rising like heat from their bodies. Quiet, she commanded, and something in her voice cut through the panic like her blade through air. Listen to me. The team fell silent except for their ragged breathing, and she could feel their eyes searching for her in the darkness. Whatever is doing this is using some kind of electromagnetic pulse to disable your technology, she said. But that means they are coming to fight us up close. How can we fight without weapons? Someone whimpered. Una held up her sword, and the blade caught what little light remained and threw it back at them like defiance given physical form. You find something sharp or heavy, and you remember that your ancestors fought for millions of years before anyone invented plasma, she said. Now move. She led them away from the approaching sound and deeper into the outpost where the emergency lights still flickered with enough glow to see by, and as they moved, she grabbed anything that could serve as a weapon. A length of metal pipe torn from the wall went to Vex, and a heavy wrench from a toolkit went to another soldier, and soon everyone had something in their hands. Even if it was only a jagged piece of debris, Sari stayed close to Una with a medical kit strapped to her back and a steel rod clutched in her trembling hands, and her 4 eyes were wide with fear. But she did not run. What are they? Sari whispered. What could do this to Coalition technology? I do not know, Una admitted, but we will find out soon enough. They reached a junction in the corridors where 3 paths branched off in different directions, and Una held up her hand to stop the group while she listened. From the left came the distant sound of voices, weak and frightened, calling out for help in at least 4 different languages. Survivors, Vex said. We have to reach them and walk into a trap, Una replied. Those voices could be recordings meant to lure us in, but even as she spoke, she knew they had no choice because they had come here to rescue people, and those people might still be alive. Somewhere in this nightmare, we split up, she decided. Vex takes half the team and circles around to approach from the south corridor while I take the rest straight through. That is foolish, Vex protested. We should stay together. If we stay together and walk into an ambush, we all die, Una said. If we split up, then at least one group might survive to complete the mission. Vex stared at her for a long moment, and then nodded because he was old enough to recognize wisdom even when it came from a human with a primitive sword. The team separated, and Una led her group forward with Sari right behind her. and 4 soldiers following with their improvised weapons raised and ready. The corridor twisted and turned, and the voices grew louder until they reached a large chamber. That must have been the outpost's main gathering hall. What she saw there made her blood run cold. At least 30 beings huddled in the center of the room, bound with cables and surrounded by guards, unlike anything Yuna had ever seen. They were tall and thin with bodies that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and they wore armor that pulsed with a dark energy that made her eyes ache to look at it. The Silent Ones. Her mind supplied, remembering rumors she had heard in Coalition, intelligence briefings about a mysterious faction that could disable any technology at will. There were a dozen of them guarding the prisoners, and each one held a weapon that looked like a blade of solid shadow. Lieutenant. One of her soldiers whispered, "We cannot fight that. We should fall back and wait for reinforcements." Yuna looked at the prisoners and saw the fear in their eyes and the hope that sparked when they noticed her team watching from the shadows. Among them, she recognized the uniforms of Coalition officers, high-ranking ones whose knowledge and authority made them valuable beyond measure. If the Silent Ones took them away, then whatever secrets they carried would be lost forever. "Get the prisoners out when I create an opening," Yuna said quietly. "What opening?" the soldier asked. "There are 12 of them and 1 of you." Yuna adjusted her grip on her sword and thought about her father and his father before him and all the generations of her family who had carried this blade into battles they should not have been able to win. "Watch and learn," she said. She stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the chamber, and every Silent One turned toward her with movements that were too fluid to be natural. The leader of the guards made a sound that might have been laughter, though it contained no warmth or humor. "A human," it said, and its voice was like wind through dead leaves. "With a metal blade, how amusing. I am Lieutenant Yuna Park of the Coalition Defense Force," she replied, "and I am here for those prisoners. Then you are here to die." The leader raised its shadow blade, and the others formed a semicircle around her, and Yuna felt a strange calm settle over her heart as she faced impossible odds. This was what her family had trained for across 5 generations. Not easy victories, but the hardest fights against the darkest enemies. She moved before they expected her to, closing the distance to the nearest guard in 2 quick steps and bringing her sword around in an arc that caught it across the chest. The Silent One fell with a shriek of surprise, and its companions rushed forward to avenge it. Yuna became a whirlwind of steel, ducking beneath shadow blades and striking back with precision that came from a lifetime of practice, and her sword sang its deadly song with every swing. She took wounds, a cut across her arm and a gash along her ribs, but she did not slow down. Because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing everyone who was counting on her behind. She heard shouts as her team rushed forward to free the prisoners, and she allowed herself a moment of fierce joy even as another blade sliced across her back. Sari appeared at her side, swinging her steel rod with desperate strength, and the blow caught a Silent One in the head and sent it staggering backward. "I told you to stay back," Yuna shouted. "You taught me that warriors protect each other," Sari shouted back. Together they held the line against the remaining guards while the prisoners were cut free and guided toward the exit, and the Silent Ones pressed harder as they realized their captives were escaping. The leader came at Yuna with a fury that drove her backward step by step, and its shadow blade left trails of darkness in the air that burned wherever they touched her skin. But she had been fighting since before she could walk, and she had been losing since the day she was born, and she knew that sometimes victory came not from being stronger, but from refusing to fall. She found an opening and drove her blade through the leader's chest, and it screamed with a sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The remaining Silent Ones fled into the darkness, and Yuna stood alone in the center of the chamber, surrounded by fallen enemies, with her sword dripping and her body burning with pain. Then her legs gave out and the floor rushed up to meet her, and everything went black. 3 days after the duel, the whispers still followed Yuna through the corridors of Nexus Prime, like shadows that would not fade, no matter how bright the lights burned overhead. Some said she had cheated, though none could explain how, and others claimed the Kreth warrior had simply been tired from earlier training, and a few suggested that her small size had confused Zorth because he had never fought something so tiny before. None of them wanted to admit that a human with a steel sword had simply been the better fighter. Commander Thalos had assigned her to teach the lowest-ranked cadets in the academy, the ones who struggled with even basic combat forms, and everyone understood this was meant as an insult to show her that her victory had earned her nothing. But Yuna accepted the assignment without complaint and reported to the small training room at the edge of the station, where her new students waited with expressions that ranged from curiosity to resentment. There were 8 of them, all from different species, and they looked at her with the same doubt she had seen in every face since she arrived. All except one, a young Melvini named Sari, sat at the front of the group with her silver-blue skin shimmering under the lights, and her 4 eyes fixed on Yuna with an intensity that felt almost physical, where the others slouched and whispered among themselves. Sari sat perfectly still and perfectly attentive, and when Yuna began to speak, she listened as if every word was precious. "I am not here to teach you how to use plasma weapons," Yuna said, "because you already have instructors for that, and they are far more experienced than I am." The cadets shifted uncomfortably, because this was not how introductions usually went. "I am here to teach you something the plasma cannot give you," she continued. "I am here to teach you how to fight when the technology fails." She drew her steel sword and held it up for them to see, and a few of the cadets laughed softly, but Sari leaned forward with her eyes growing wider. "Every weapon in this academy requires power," Yuna said. "Plasma blades need energy cells, and shields need generators, and even the simplest stun weapon needs a charge to function." She brought the sword down in a slow arc that made the air whisper, "This needs nothing but my arm and my will." The lesson continued for 2 hours, and by the end of it, most of the cadets had returned to their skepticism and their quiet mockery. But Sarah remained behind when the others left. "Lieutenant Park," she said, her voice soft and musical in the way of her species, "I wish to learn from you." Yuna looked at this young cadet, who could not have been more than the equivalent of 18 human years, and saw something in those 4 eyes that she recognized: hunger. Not for food or power, but for knowledge and for a purpose greater than simply following the path laid out before her. "Why?" Yuna asked. "Because I watched you defeat Zorth," Sari said, "and I saw something the others did not see." "And what was that?" "I saw that you were never afraid," Sari answered. "Not because you were foolish, but because you understood something about combat that he did not understand. Something deeper than technology, something true." Yuna felt a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth despite her attempts to remain professional. "Come to my quarters tomorrow at the 6th hour," she said, "and bring something to write with, because you will have much to learn." Sari's face lit up with joy, and she bowed deeply before hurrying away, and Yuna watched her go with a warmth spreading through her chest that surprised her. Perhaps this assignment would not be entirely without rewards. The next morning, Yuna was summoned to Commander Thelus's office, where a dozen senior officers had gathered around a holographic display that showed a small mining outpost on a distant asteroid. "We have lost contact with Outpost KV-7, Thalos said without greeting her. "It has been silent for 18 hours and all attempts to reach them have failed." "Pirates," one of the officers suggested. "Or perhaps a reactor failure." "We do not know," Talos replied. "And that is why we are sending a rescue team to investigate." He turned those amber eyes toward Yuna, and she saw something cold lurking in their depths. "Lieutenant Park has volunteered to join the mission." Yuna had not volunteered for anything, but she understood immediately what was happening, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. "I am honored to serve," she said. "Excellent. Thalos replied with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. You will depart in 2 hours with a team of 12 soldiers. Try not to let your primitive weapons slow them down. The briefing continued with tactical information and supply lists, and Yuna memorized every detail, because she had learned long ago that preparation was the difference between victory and death. When she returned to her quarters to gather her equipment, she found Sari waiting outside her door. I heard about the mission, the young Melvinus said. I want to come with you. Absolutely not, Yuna replied. You are a cadet, and this is a combat operation. I scored highest in my class on navigation and emergency medical procedures. Sari insisted. The team will need support personnel, and I am qualified. You are also young and untested, and I will not be responsible for getting you killed. Sari straightened to her full height, which was not very impressive, and fixed all 4 of her eyes on Yuna with fierce determination. You said you would teach me, she said. How can I learn if I never see real combat? Yuna wanted to argue, but she saw herself in this stubborn young cadet, and she remembered being told that she was too young and too inexperienced, and too human to ever amount to anything. I will speak to the mission commander, she said finally, but if he says no, then you will accept it without argument. Sari nodded eagerly and followed Yuna to the hangar where the rescue team was assembling, and the mission commander turned out to be a grizzled Torvan warrior named Vex, who looked at the young cadet with tired eyes. Another body for the count, he said with a shrug. Fine. She can manage the medical supplies and stay out of the way when the shooting starts. 2 hours later, they were aboard a fast transport ship cutting through the void toward a silent outpost and a mystery that none of them could have imagined. The asteroid came into view as a dark shape against the stars, and the outpost clung to its surface like a metal growth. All sharp angles and blinking lights that should have been a comforting sign of life. But as they drew closer, they saw that some of those lights were flickering in patterns that no normal system would produce. Something is wrong, Vex muttered. I can feel it in my scales. He ordered the pilot to bring them in on the far side of the outpost away from the main hangar, and they touched down on the rocky surface with a gentle thump that still managed to echo through the ship. Weapons ready, Vex commanded. We go in quiet and fast, and we find out what happened to these people. The team moved through the airlock and into the outpost corridors, and immediately Yuna knew that they were not dealing with pirates or mechanical failure. The walls were scorched with blast marks, and the floor was scattered with debris, and everywhere she looked, she saw signs of a battle that the defenders had lost badly. And then the lights went out, and every plasma weapon in the team died at exactly the same moment. Panic erupted as soldiers shouted and stumbled in the sudden darkness, and Yuna heard the hum of something approaching from deeper in the outpost. She drew her steel sword, and the blade caught the faint emergency lighting and gleamed. Like a promise in the shadows, whatever was coming would not find her helpless. The transport ship docked at Nexus Prime with a gentle shudder that ran through the metal floors and up through the boots of Lieutenant Yuna Park as she gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark into a world where she would be the stranger. She had traveled for 3 weeks across Coalition space to reach this prestigious academy where the greatest warriors from dozens of species trained together, and she carried with her only a single bag of personal items and one long case that held the most important thing she owned. The doors opened, and she stepped onto the station platform where the air smelled recycled and sterile, and the lights overhead cast everything in a pale blue glow that made her skin look almost gray. A young officer of a species she did not recognize waited for her with a datapad clutched in 4 of his 6 hands, and he looked at her with large, compound eyes that revealed nothing of what he thought about this small human woman standing before him. Lieutenant Park, he said in a voice that buzzed slightly at the edges. I am Cadet Melnick, and I have been assigned to escort you to the academy. Commander for your orientation briefing. Yuna nodded, and followed him through corridors filled with beings of every shape and size imaginable, and she noticed how many of them carried weapons that hummed with energy or glowed with the telltale blue of plasma technology. They walked for nearly 20 minutes through the massive station until they reached a set of doors that opened into an enormous training hall where hundreds of cadets practiced combat drills under the watchful eyes of their instructors. The noise hit her like a wave as plasma blades clashed and energy shields crackled, and instructors shouted corrections in a dozen different languages that her translator struggled to keep up with. At the far end of the hall stood a raised platform where several senior officers observed the training, and Cadet Melnick led her directly toward them. Through the chaos of the practice floor, she felt eyes turning toward her as she walked and heard whispers in languages her translator caught only fragments of, but the tone was clear enough, even without full understanding. Who was this human, and why was she here among the elite warriors of the Coalition? The officers on the platform turned as she approached, and she saw immediately which one was in command by the way the others positioned themselves around him. Commander Thelos was a Vexari, tall and thin with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with an inner amber light, and he looked down at her with an expression that mixed curiosity with something that might have been contempt. "Lieutenant Park," he said, and his voice carried easily over the noise of the training hall. "The human exchange instructor we were promised by Coalition Command." "Yes, sir," Una replied, keeping her voice steady and her posture straight. "You will be teaching advanced combat techniques to our cadets." Delos continued, "Though I confess, I am curious what techniques a species as young as humanity could possibly offer to warriors who have been perfecting their arts for thousands of years." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the nearby cadets, who had stopped their training to watch this exchange, and Una felt their amusement like heat against her skin. "I understand your skepticism, Commander," she said, "and I hope to demonstrate the value of what I have to offer." Thelos gestured toward the long case she carried over her shoulder, and his amber eyes narrowed with interest. "And what weapon have you brought to our academy, Lieutenant?" "I see no plasma generator or energy cell on that case." Una unslung the case and opened it carefully, and the laughter that had been merely a ripple before became a wave that crashed through the entire hall as she drew out her weapon. It was a sword forged from steel, the blade gleaming silver under the blue lights, with a handle wrapped in leather that had been worn smooth by generations of hands, and there was not a single piece of technology anywhere on it. "A metal blade," Thelos said, and his voice dripped with disbelief. "You have come to the finest combat academy in the Coalition, carrying a sharpened piece of metal. This sword has been in my family for 5 generations, Una said calmly, "and it has never failed a Park who carried it into battle. Perhaps because your family never faced a real battle," called out a voice from the crowd, and a massive Kreth warrior pushed forward to stand at the base of the platform. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, with scales the color of dried blood and muscles that bunched and coiled beneath his armored skin, and in his hand he held a plasma blade that hummed with barely contained energy. "I am Zorath of the Kreth Dominion," he announced, "and I challenge this human to demonstrate her primitive weapon against a real warrior." The hall fell silent as every eye turned to Una, and she could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her because they all knew how this would end. A steel sword against a plasma blade that could cut through starship hulls was no contest at all, and they were already imagining her humiliation. "I accept," Una said simply. Thelos raised one hand, and the cadets quickly cleared a space in the center of the hall and formed a ring around it. And Una walked down from the platform to take her position across from the Kreth warrior Zorath activated his plasma blade fully, and the weapon roared to life with a sound like a caged sun, and the heat from it made the air shimmer between them. Una held her steel sword in a two-handed grip and settled into a stance that felt as natural as breathing. because she had been training in this position since she could walk. "When you are ready," Thelos called out, "you may begin." Zoroth lunged forward with a roar, his plasma blade sweeping down in an arc that would have cut her in half from shoulder to hip. But Yuna was not there when the blade arrived. She moved like water flowing around a stone, her footwork carrying her to the side and past the superheated edge of his weapon, and her steel sword sang through the air. The crest spun and slashed again and again, each strike powerful enough to end the fight in an instant, but each one found only empty air where the human had been a heartbeat before. And then Yuna saw what she had been waiting for. His plasma blade flickered for just a fraction of a second as the power cell cycled between maximum strikes. A pause so brief that most warriors would never notice it. But Yuna had been watching for exactly this moment. She struck in that tiny window of vulnerability, her steel blade ringing against the hilt of his weapon, and with a twist of her wrists, she sent the plasma sword spinning away across the floor before Zoroth could react. Her blade was at his throat, the edge pressing gently against his scales, and the hall was utterly silent. "I yield," Zoroth whispered, his eyes wide with shock. Yuna stepped back and lowered her sword, and the silence stretched on for a long moment. Before someone began to clap, the most of the cadets simply stared, already convincing themselves that what they had seen was luck or trickery, because surely a steel sword could never truly defeat plasma on the platform above. Commander Thelos watched with narrowed eyes, and something that might have been the first seed of doubt planted in his ancient warrior's heart